Have you ever found yourself in the middle of a family gathering, maybe you're sitting around a holiday table, and you start telling this story?
Oh, yeah.
And it's this vivid, perfectly preserved memory from your childhood.
Yeah.
You can see the specific color of the linoleum floor. You can smell the damp wool of the winter coats in the hallway.
You have all the sensory details locked in.
Exactly. You know the exact sequence of events. And then, right as you hit the emotional crescendo or the punchline, a sibling or a parent looks at you with just utter bewilderment. And they swear up and down that the event never happened.
Or they insist it did happen, but you weren't even the one who's there. Which is almost worse.
It is. Or maybe you've discovered well into your adulthood that a cherished family anecdote, like a story that practically defined your family's identity, was wildly, almost unrecognizably exaggerated.
Which is a profoundly jarring moment.
Right. It's the exact second you realize that your memories, the very building blocks of your identity, might be a solo project rather than a shared objective reality.
And that disorientation is really profound because it strikes right at the core of our early developmental understanding of the world. Because when we are young, our family unit is our entire universe.
You don't just share a house.
Exactly. We implicitly believe we share a singular, objective reality. A child assumes that everyone under that roof is experiencing the same environmental stimuli, interpreting the emotional events the exact same way, and recording the identical history into their long-term memory.
But then we grow up.
We do. And as we mature and individuate, those separate internal recordings begin to play back in social settings. And we're confronted with the unsettling fact that the tapes simply do not match. The subjective nature of human memory just completely collides with our desperate need for a stable, shared history.
Well, that collision is the exact mission for our Deep Dive today. We're going to explore the messy, beautiful, and honestly sometimes deeply tragic intersection of memory, objective truth, and family mythology.
It's such a rich area to explore.
It really is. We're going to examine how a family constructs its shared identity, who gets to act as the architect of that identity, and most importantly, what happens when that shared reality inevitably fractures.
And to anchor this exploration, we are looking at some incredibly evocative excerpts from a memoir titled Next of Kin by Gabrielle Hamilton.
Now, a lot of people might recognize her name.
Yes, she is a celebrated adult food writer and a New York Times bestselling author. However, these specific passages we're looking at today are not about her professional culinary journey at all.
No, not at all.
They offer this deep, unflinching, and highly analytical look at her childhood and the sprawling, deeply eccentric family dynamic that completely shaped her understanding of truth.
And we really need to set the stage for this because Gabrielle's memoir is not a cozy, nostalgic romp through the good old days.
Far from it.
It's an intricate examination of a highly vibrant, chaotic family of 7. We are talking about 2 larger-than-life parents and 5 children living in this massive, Warren-like house in Pennsylvania in the 1970s.
It's a very specific ecosystem.
It is. And as we move through these memories, I want you to actively think about your own family's dynamic. You know, who are the designated storytellers in your life? Who are the rigid fact checkers?
Because every family has them.
They do. And how do the narrative roles we are assigned, or maybe the roles we subconsciously adopt as children, echo into our professional and personal lives as adults?
Looking at a family through the lens of narrative construction is incredibly revealing. Because every family, whether they actively realize it or not, operates as a myth-making machine.
Oh, absolutely.
There are the polished stories we tell outsiders to project a certain status, the dark stories we collectively bury because they threaten the cohesion, and the mundane stories we just embellish to command attention at dinner. Understanding the mechanics of that myth-making really helps us understand our own relationship with the truth.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start right where Gabrielle starts, which is with a voicemail.
A very heavy voicemail.
Very heavy. She's now an adult writing a monthly food column for the New York Times Magazine. And out of the blue, she receives a voicemail from her mother, who is in her late 80s, living alone on a remote mountain in Vermont.
Yeah.
And the context here is crucial. They haven't spoken in any meaningful way in about 30 years.
30 years of profound silence, just punctuated suddenly by a mundane medium like a voicemail. And what is striking is how Gabrielle analyzes the tonal shift in her mother's voice on that recording.
She breaks it down so clinically.
She really does.
Yeah.
She describes how the message begins with the mother attempting to sound clarion and imperious. She's channeling that larger-than-life authoritarian figure who, in Gabrielle's childhood, seemed to basically command the elements.
But it doesn't last.
No, that facade quickly crumbles. The voice turns watery, apprehensive, and undeniably small.
And the reason for that smallness is what makes this so compelling. The mother leaves this trembly message to say that a fact-checker from the New York Times has just called her. The magazine is doing its due diligence on an essay Gabrielle wrote about a simple tomato and mayonnaise sandwich that her mother used to make for them during a summer vacation in Corsica nearly 50 years prior.
A 50-year-old sandwich memory.
Exactly. But the mother is absolutely terrified by this intrusion. She leaves the voicemail asking, essentially, a single, highly vulnerable question. Was the essay kind or unkind?
What's fascinating here is the immediate, palpable inversion of the power dynamics. The mother, who we will soon see was an absolute uncompromising force of authority during those formative years, is now reduced to a state of deep vulnerability.
She's scared.
She is suddenly afraid of how she is being immortalized in print by the daughter she is completely estranged from. It surfaces this incredible tension that exists in any family with a writer. It's the fear of the written word and the terror of losing control over your own legacy when someone else holds the pen, because the person who controls the narrative controls the reality.
And Gabrielle's own internal reaction to this is equally complex. She admits that earlier in her career, she absolutely loathed fact-checkers.
She couldn't stand them.
She felt their rigid insistence on dry data and verifiable documents ruined the poetry and the majesty of her prose. She recounts getting genuinely annoyed when an editor would ask for supporting evidence for an emotional essay about something as simple as radishes with butter.
She firmly believed that the bare facts were inherently inadequate without the writer's poetic license to burnish their meaning and guide the reader's emotional response.
But that instinct, to prioritize poetry over data, it isn't born in a vacuum. It's a direct inheritance from her father, James Harvey Peterman Hamilton, or Daddy-O as they called him.
And to understand her initial aversion to objective truth, we really have to deeply analyze the thematic core of the family, which was completely established by his worldview.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Her father was a professional scenic designer. He ran a massive, bustling design and build studio that fabricated elaborate sets for Broadway productions, for the Ringling Brothers Circus, and for massive industrial expos.
His literal daily occupation was to build fake worlds out of plywood, canvas, and staple guns.
Yes. And he seemingly applied that exact same theatrical philosophy to his personal life, his parenting, and his storytelling.
His entire professional existence was predicated on the concept of forced perspective and illusion. The core tenet of scenic design is that the structure only needs to look real from the audience's specific vantage point in the dark.
Good enough for theater.
Exactly. Good enough for theater was his prevailing standard. He had no interest in the rigorous, weight-bearing engineering of an architect. His sole focus was on the romance of the visual impact.
He would leave the bones to the draftsman.
He openly admitted it. He would conceptualize and design these beautiful, sweeping, evocative sets. But the math, the structural integrity, the reality of gravity, that was for someone else. He was there to deliver the romance, not the reality.
And he lived that commitment to the romantic facade down to the smallest bureaucratic details of his life. Gabrielle notes that he wouldn't even sign his name legibly on official documents.
He refused to.
Instead of providing a verifiable signature for a notary or a bank clerk, he would just slash a bold, aggressive pair of lines and a hovering dot. He viewed knitting together actual letters to please the bureaucracy as just completely beneath him. He was proudly, theatrically non-compliant.
And when it came to his dinner parties, his storytelling was utterly ruthless. He openly championed the theft of good ideas, telling his children that nobody actually possesses new ideas. Genius is merely knowing who to steal from and how to deliver it.
Consider the psychological impact of that on a developing child. He would casually lift anecdotes, recipes, profound quotes from other people's lives, and seamlessly present them to his captivated dinner guests as if they were his own lived experiences.
And it goes further. Even more unsettling, he would co-opt Gabrielle's own personal experiences. He would radically rewrite the narrative arc, assign her emotional reactions she never actually felt, and present her distorted life to the dinner table as a polished punchline.
And if anyone at the table dared to interrupt the performance, to offer a correction, if a family member tried to interject with, "Wait, that's not how it really happened," He would dismiss them with absolute contempt.
His defense was always exactly the same. Accuracy is for clerks.
He would yell that accuracy was for the bean counters. He would actually go so far as to pantomime a squinting, hunched accountant pushing up his glasses, physically mocking the very concept of objective truth.
He firmly believed that a meticulous accounting of facts, whether an event transpired on a Tuesday or a Friday, or whether the sandwich had mayonnaise or butter, was the petty, unimaginative concern of dull minds.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of cognitive development, you can see how this environment profoundly warps a child's understanding of reality.
Absolutely. If your primary male caretaker, who is charismatic, successful, and beloved by his peers, constantly demonstrates that truth is entirely flexible, that a compelling narrative arc is vastly superior to factual data, you inherently internalize that value system.
You learn that reality is a raw material to be manipulated for social currency.
And Gabrielle candidly admits she inherited this exact trait. She recognized within herself an undisciplined tendency to exaggerate, a compulsion to brush what she calls a few coats of saturating pigment onto her memories.
Because she harbored this deep-seated fear that the spare, naked truth, unadorned by theatricality, wouldn't leave a sufficient emotional impact on the listener or the reader.
But the narrative arc of the memoir shows a really beautiful evolution. That opening scene with the elderly mother and the New York Times fact-checker represents a paradigm shift.
It does. After years of the grueling editorial process at the Times, where a simple piece about honeycomb tripe might go through 4 rigorous editors, Gabrielle actually learns to crave the fact-checkers.
She develops a beautiful metaphor for this, describing verifiable facts as a soft woven hammock that is tethered securely between the solid, unmoving trees of in. It checks out, and your story squares up.
The objective facts transform from a rigid constraint into a place of profound safety.
They become a boundary where she can finally rest, protected from her own inherited, exhausting impulses to constantly embellish and perform.
That transition from resenting facts to seeking refuge in them is a profound psychological maturation. She consciously chooses the grounding rigidity of the fact-checker over the untethered fluidity of the storyteller.
But it prompts a deeply necessary reflection on how we all operate in our daily lives.
Think about your own life for a second. When you were at a party, telling a story about a nightmare travel experience or a spectacularly bad date, do you act as a rigorous historian of your own life?
Probably not.
Or do you channel a bit of daddy-o? Do you add that coat of saturating pigment? Do you conveniently merge 2 separate frustrating events into one single afternoon just because it makes the climax of the story hit harder?
Do you exaggerate the rudeness of the waiter to guarantee a laugh from the room? We all curate our lived experiences to some degree to foster connection.
We all desire to be the compelling storyteller. But the crucial question Gabrielle's memoir forces us to ask is, at what point does the performance of the story begin to override and erase the actual, authentic lived experience?
And that question becomes a matter of absolute psychological survival when we turn our attention to the overarching mythology this specific family constructed. Because the parents described in Gabrielle's writing are not merely eccentric or quirky.
No, they are depicted as mythic, almost terrifyingly grand archetypes in the eyes of their young children, at least during the years prior to the family's collapse. Let's focus on the mother for a moment.
The way she is described borders on the supernatural.
She was a former ballerina, a woman who had danced in the corps de ballet at the Metropolitan Opera in New York City. She possessed the glamour of someone who had painted on winged black eyeliner in mirrored dressing rooms.
But translating that intense physical discipline into the role of a mother to 5 children resulted in what Gabrielle describes as literal spider senses.
Her sensory attunement to her children was practically paranormal, and it functioned as a mechanism of absolute control.
The memoir details how, in this massive, rambling Pennsylvania house with its distinct tiny attic rooms, heavy doors, and long, labyrinthine corridors, the mother could somehow hear a child salivating before they threw up from 3 entire hallways away.
From the dead bottom depth of a REM sleep cycle.
Yes, she would detect the subtle, rhythmic swallowing of a nauseous child, navigate the dark house, and be standing at their bedside with a cool washcloth before the child had even fully woken up to realize they were sick.
That is an astonishing, almost suffocating level of maternal vigilance. And it was coupled with a fiercely strict, uncompromising domestic environment. This was not a relaxed household of sugary cereals, chaotic playrooms, and Saturday morning cartoons.
The memoir specifies that there were absolutely no pacifiers allowed, no soft-footed pajamas, no thumb-sucking tolerated.
The physical environment reflected this rigidity. It was filled with sharp, expensive Nakashima coffee tables, fragile Steuben glass, and austere homemade granola. She was the absolute enforcer of the rules, and her standard was nothing short of perfection.
Now contrast that maternal environment with the father, who projected a completely different energetic frequency, yet was equally absolute and demanding in his worldview.
He is the man driving a Mustang, perpetually wearing aviator sunglasses, exuding a breezy, mid-century masculine charisma.
But underneath that romance was a harsh pragmatism. This is a man who gave up a career in fine art painting simply because he took an unsparing, objective inventory of his own talents and decided the world did not need another mediocre painter.
He deemed himself and also ran in the fine arts.
And rather than tolerate his own mediocrity, he pivoted entirely to a commercial trade where the standard of good enough for theater allowed him to excel.
And he actively instilled that terror of being in also ran into his children. There is a memory where a 6-year-old Gabrielle is helping him lay heavy masonry for a deck.
A grueling job for a child.
While doing this grueling physical labor, he looks at his young daughter and says, "Who is ever going to remember Barry Goldwater?"
He is lecturing a first grader on the ultimate failure of a defeated presidential candidate.
He explicitly instructed her to never, ever put on a resume that she was a runner-up or that she was shortlisted for an award because, in his eyes, advertising that you almost won is just pathetic bragging that you ultimately failed to secure the victory.
Put yourself in the shoes of a developing child trying to build a stable sense of self in that specific ecosystem. On one side, you have a mother demanding intense physical and behavioral perfection, operating with an almost frightening, omniscient presence where no mistake goes unnoticed.
Now on the other side,
you have a father demanding a ruthless, unsentimental standard of excellence, a vocal rejection of anything that reeks of mediocrity, all while he simultaneously performs this dazzling, fundamentally dishonest theatrical version of reality for his social circle. It is a psychological pressure cooker.
Okay, let's unpack this, because there is a brilliant, hyper-specific anecdote in Gabrielle's writing that perfectly, almost violently, illustrates the collision of these two mythic parental figures.
It is the story of the father finally quitting smoking.
The infamous Camel filterless cigarettes incident. This scene is a masterclass in domestic cognitive dissonance.
It really is. Set the scene.
Okay, so picture the early 1970s. The entire family is gathered in the kitchen on a bright morning. The 5 kids are eating their austere homemade granola. The morning sunlight is hitting the terracotta floor. It's a scene of domestic order.
Very peaceful.
Suddenly, the father descends the stairs, looking entirely ashen, physically undone, and terrified. He dramatically crumples his pack of Camel filterless cigarettes and hurls them into the garbage can.
And then he launches into the story.
He proceeds to recount a harrowing, hyper-detailed, terrifying tale of the night he has just survived. He tells his children that he woke up in the pitch black, drowning in the fluid of his own lungs.
He describes choking on a smoker's cough so bloody, so violently prolonged that he genuinely believed he was crossing the threshold of death.
He describes a mortal terror seizing his mind, and he solemnly swears to his family that he will never touch another cigarette as long as he lives.
It is a masterful, captivating performance. He has the entire kitchen wrapped. The children are practically in a state of rigor mortis, entirely captivated by the absolute veracity and the visceral, terrifying detail of their invincible father's near-death experience.
He is functioning as the ultimate storyteller, delivering his best, most high-stakes material to a captive audience. But the true psychological weight of the scene relies entirely on the mother's reaction.
Which is devastating.
The mother, who is casually standing at the kitchen sink washing dishes, slowly turns around. She stares at her husband with what Gabrielle describes as operatic incomprehension.
Drawing on her own theatrical lineage, remembering her grandfather, who was an opera singer in Lyon.
She projects her voice to the very rafters of the kitchen and delivers 2 devastating words. Possible. Not possible.
What we're really seeing there is the mother completely, flatly, and publicly denying his entire reality. And her justification is rooted entirely in her own spider senses.
She states, with absolute, unshakable authority, that there is not a single possibility that he spent the night violently choking and hacking on the brink of death because she did not hear a single sound all night.
In her mind, her hearing is infallible. It is an objective law of physics in that house. Therefore, because her senses did not register the event, his experience simply did not happen in the physical world. She insists, in front of the children, that he must have merely dreamt the entire ordeal.
So what does this all mean for the 5 kids sitting frozen at that butcher block table? Think about how profoundly disorienting that paradigm is for a child's developing brain.
You have one primary attachment figure recounting a lived, traumatic, physically life-altering experience with total emotional conviction.
And you have your other primary attachment figure with equal and opposite certainty claiming the event is entirely fictional.
Psychologists often refer to this as inducing a bifurcated reality, and it borders on ambient gaslighting. Who is the child supposed to trust?
Right. Do you align with the charismatic storyteller who shapes the emotional narrative? Or do you align with the rigid fact-checker who relies solely on empirical sensory data?
The beautiful, lingering irony of that specific anecdote, as Gabrielle astutely points out, is that regardless of whether the choking fit was lived in reality or vividly dreamt in REM sleep, it functioned perfectly as truth.
The father genuinely never smoked another cigarette.
The narrative achieved its intended outcome completely independent of the objective facts. But for a child trying to learn how to navigate the world, it teaches a dangerous lesson.
That reality is highly subjective, and truth is not a shared baseline, but rather a perpetual battleground between competing authorities.
And navigating a daily battleground of subjective truth requires some serious, almost feral survival skills, which seamlessly brings us to perhaps the most fascinating, complex figure in this entire family dynamic.
The oldest brother, Jeffrey.
Jeffrey is a case study in how a child adapts to such a high-pressure, mythic environment. He was also known by various monikers, J.J. Bone, Fester, the Marquis of Debris.
He is 9 years older than Gabrielle, and in her formative eyes, he is an absolute untouchable god. He operates as a mythic figure in his own right, seemingly existing on a plane entirely independent of the parents' jurisdiction.
He genuinely reads like a character out of a magical realism novel. Gabrielle describes him as a dedicated amateur anthropologist.
When he is just a teenager, he commandeers a tilting, abandoned potting shed on a neighbor's adjacent property. He systematically fills it with animal skulls he's cleaned, antique glass bottles dug from the dirt, and flint arrowheads he meticulously tracked down in freshly plowed fields.
He becomes entirely obsessed with the philosophy of living purely off the land, seeking a perfect synchronization with the brutal reality of the natural world.
His commitment goes far beyond the typical teenage outdoors phase. The memoir outlines a high school senior project where he legally arranges to go deep into the woods with only prehistoric tools that he handcrafted himself, intending to survive for a full week.
Interestingly, the supplies he chooses to pack are sprouts, of all things. Yes, the reality of the woods quickly degrades his romantic ideals, and he ends up surviving by eating raw robin's eggs from a nest and the raw liver of a snake he managed to kill.
He is relentlessly, almost punishingly, pursuing this romanticized, absolute ideal of the ancient hunter-gatherer. And the absolute most arresting cinematic image of Jeffrey's obsession involves a roadkill deer.
This story is wild.
Gabrielle recounts waking up from a lazy afternoon nap one day, wandering out into the tall grass of the back meadow, and discovering a 130-pound white-tailed deer hanging completely upside down from a thick tree branch, slowly bleeding out.
Jeffrey had found it dead on the side of the highway and physically hauled the massive carcass home.
And he doesn't just butcher it. He engages in the ancient, laborious process of tanning the hide. He meticulously extracts the sinew from the animal, dries it in the baking sun to create durable thread, and actually sews himself a functional pair of deerskin pants, only resorting to modern brass rivets when his patience for bone needles finally runs out.
It is an incredible, almost intimidating display of dedication, patience, and frankly, profound eccentricity. It highlights a deeply intense, obsessive drive within Jeffrey to physically enact his philosophical beliefs.
This isn't just a boy playing in the woods. He is deeply ideologically committed to finding a truth purer than the one his parents offer. And this drive culminates when he's 19 years old and literally hitchhikes to the continent of Africa.
He simply walks out the kitchen door, thumbs a ride to the massive industrial shipping port in Port Newark, New Jersey, and manages to secure passage on a towering cargo ship loaded with industrial propane and commercial yogurt.
And spends weeks sailing across the Atlantic Ocean, His ultimate destination is the absolute center of the Ituri forest in the Belgian Congo, where he intends to live alongside the Mabuti pygmies.
Try to imagine the impact of that on young Gabrielle, who is roughly 10 years old at the time. To her, this journey is electrifying. It is the stuff of ancient legends. She explicitly compares him to the hero Gilgamesh entering the sacred cedar forest.
She goes to her mundane elementary school and aggressively boasts to her classmates about her brother drinking fermented manioc wine, stoically treating his own tropical ringworm infections with sharp X-Acto knives and mysterious yellow powders, and standing witness to visceral elephant hunts where indigenous hunters slice the tendons in the back of the elephant's massive knees.
She essentially borrows his immense cinematic interestingness to make her own small life feel profound.
But Gabrielle is also deeply observant, and she notes a sharp duality to Jeffrey. He isn't solely this solemn, philosophical nature boy seeking spiritual enlightenment. He is equally a master prankster with a deeply chaotic streak.
He possesses this wild, sudden, hyena-like laugh, a harsh car starter laugh that visually breaks his face open. And he absolutely delights in elaborate, highly strategic, and sometimes borderline cruel practical jokes.
He's the guy who meticulously unscrews the caps and puts milk in the salt shakers at a crowded ski lodge. He sneaks up and pours a pitcher of freezing ice water onto a cousin's chair right before they sit down at a formal graduation luncheon.
Which leads us to the infamous freeze tag anecdote. This singular memory perfectly, elegantly encapsulates Jeffrey's brilliant, highly strategic, and somewhat emotionally detached method of moving through the world and interacting with his family.
The freeze tag story is incredible. It takes place in the heavy, humid, stagnant aftermath of a late summer hurricane. A large group of neighborhood kids are running completely wild in the yard.
Jeffrey, the older teenager playing with the little kids, gets tagged and frozen on the crest of a small hill.
He stands perfectly still and begins to whisper shout to little Gabrielle, begging her to come rescue him. Gabrielle feels the immense, intoxicating weight of this responsibility. She, the little sister, has the power to free her absolute idol, the oldest brother.
She drops to the ground, elbows crawling through the wet, hurricane-soaked grass, playing the tactical diversion.
She finally reaches him, breathless, expecting him to reach out and tag her hand. But he doesn't move a muscle. He just stands perfectly rigid and whispers, "Tag me here." Just a little closer.
He subtly manipulates her physical positioning.
Yes, and so she takes that one final, eager, trusting leap forward, and she steps dead center with her bare foot into a massive, waterlogged pile of golden retriever poop.
And Jeffrey completely erupts.
He is howling. He is physically cut in half with maniacal, breathless laughter. He used his own body as bait, calculated the exact, precise distance of her stride, completely faked his own desperate captivity, and waited with sociopathic patience while a chaotic, screaming game happened all around him solely to execute this perfect, deeply humiliating trap on his trusting little sister.
And the truly crazy psychological twist is that Gabrielle, even while she is standing there with dog poop squishing between her bare toes, feeling the sting of humiliation, is fundamentally in awe of him.
She is giggling through her own hot tears. She instantly recognizes and respects the absolute genius of his comedic timing, his flawless spatial awareness, and his strategic, patient cunning.
This raises an important question, however, about Jeffrey's isolated inner life. Because while his family, especially Gabrielle, is captivated by the brilliance and the humor of his actions, Gabrielle's later reflection on the source material hints at much darker, more troubling undercurrents.
If we apply a psychological lens to his time in Africa, the physical letters he sends back home to Pennsylvania aren't merely thrilling Boy Scout adventure tales.
No, he meticulously writes 8, 12, sometimes 16-page letters on impossibly thin tissue paper, and these letters reveal a young man grappling with deep, festering disillusionment.
He frequently admits to being profoundly bored, intensely angry, and constantly in frustrating conflict with the local villagers he had traveled so far to understand. The memoir notes a very specific, troubling cognitive shift. Before he left for Africa, Jeffrey was the philosopher. He was asking profound existential questions like, what is the true difference between nature and self?
But once he is embedded in Africa, depressed, culturally isolated, and vexed by the daily realities of survival, his inquiries degrade. He starts writing pedantic, irritable questions like, what is the actual difference between water and a beverage?
The adult Gabrielle realizes, in agonizing retrospect, that a blunt-headed, vestigial boyhood was still desperately clinging to him. She sees that his grand soul-searching was wildly careening between the genuinely profound and the absurdly ridiculous.
She notes that if an emotionally attuned adult had been paying closer attention to those tissue paper letters, they might have recognized the signs of a young man spiraling, and they might have genuinely worried for his mental health.
He was a young man desperately seeking an unsullied, idyllic world, an absolute, uncorrupted truth rooted in nature. And he was finding that reality, no matter where you go on the globe, is always infinitely messier, more compromised, and more frustrating than the idealized narrative in his head.
He possessed a deep-seated obsessive streak, a rigid inability to let go of minor details that contradicted his internal logic. And this specific trait, this desperate insistence on absolute, unyielding correctness, persists and hardens into his adulthood.
Which brings us to the devastating scene of the lamb roast argument. Fast forward several decades, Gabrielle is now a highly successful adult. She has just achieved a monumental milestone for any writer. She has had a piece published in the legendary pages of The New Yorker.
A huge accomplishment.
The family is gathered at a picturesque summer party, roasting whole lambs on spits over an open fire. It is the very picture of an idyllic, successful family reunion. But Jeffrey is deeply agitated.
He physically pulls his sister aside, away from the celebration, because he is incredibly, viscerally frustrated by a perceived factual error in her published piece. He absolutely cannot let the detail go.
In her essay, she wrote that their family historically roasted lambs on applewood branches. Jeffrey is furious at this assertion. He adamantly insists that the historical record dictates it must have been ash branches, because apple branches naturally grow too crooked to function as proper spits.
And the tragedy of this interaction is that he isn't simply acting as a helpful older brother correcting a minor horticultural detail. He is profoundly, existentially disappointed in her integrity, and by extension, he is disgusted by The New Yorker.
He literally throws his hands up in despair and says to her, "If they let you publish that, this is the end of American literature, don't you think?"
The end of American literature, over the structural integrity of an ash branch versus an apple branch. It sounds almost comically dramatic, but it reveals how rigidly, how desperately he held on to the objective facts of their shared family history.
In a family built by a father who believed accuracy is for clerks, Jeffrey became the ultimate, uncompromising fact-checker of the family mythology. If his sister got the specific species of wood wrong, then the entire narrative of their childhood was structurally compromised in his mind.
Gabrielle realizes in that painful moment by the fire that she has to actively maintain a greater emotional distance from him. She feels a profound sadness, sensing that she is somehow outgrowing him, or at least outgrowing his exhausting, pedantic need to control the absolute truth of every memory.
And the staggering tragedy of that realization is that the argument over the ash branch is the very last time she ever sees her brother alive. A few short years later, at the age of 57, Jeffrey dies by suicide.
It is a devastating, breathless turn in the memoir.
And what is so deeply haunting is how Gabrielle, as a writer and a sister, attempts to process the mechanics of his death. Because she intimately knew his mind. Because she had been the victim of his flawless freeze tag strategy. Because she knew his aesthetic obsession with tanning deer hides and crafting bone tools. She finds herself entirely unable to separate his lifelong brilliance from his final act.
She cannot help but imagine his suicide as meticulously, flawlessly planned, as one of his elaborate practical jokes.
That is how grief often maps the unique personality of the deceased onto the tragedy itself. She envisions him carefully, methodically selecting the specific tree for his death, an ash tree, of course, the dark, devastating humor of that specific detail not escaping her writer's mind.
She imagines him curating his final appearance wearing a highly specific, rugged outfit of canvas and French blue, topped with his signature wide-brimmed hat.
She visualizes him calculating a perfectly timed jump, waiting patiently for the high noon sunbeams to hit the forest floor perfectly. And, most heartbreakingly of all, she imagines him dropping into the abyss accompanied by that explosive, maniacal, self-entertained hyena laugh.
As if the suicide itself was not an act of ultimate despair, but rather the ultimate, perfectly calculated, brilliant final statement to the world.
Is a chilling, deeply poignant, and profoundly courageous way to articulate grief, to take the undeniable brilliance of the person you idolized and map it onto the violent act that permanently took them away from you.
But Jeffrey's death also acts as a catalyst, forcing the author and us as the audience to look backward, to trace the hidden subterranean fault lines in the family foundation. Because a family that initially presents as a unified, mythic entity, a family that rallied around the single tribal word bone to hold all 7 of them together, eventually fractures completely.
And that profound fracture is the hinge upon which this entire childhood narrative violently turns. The timeline is crucial here. While Jeffrey was away in the deep jungles of Africa seeking his pure truth, the mother back in Pennsylvania abruptly, without any warning, preamble, or emotional warm-up, demands a divorce.
She calls the entire family, minus Jeffrey, into the formal dining room, stands before them, and simply announces, "Jim, it's over, and the kids and I think you should leave."
The children are completely blindsided. Gabrielle, who is young and trying to perform a facade of tough indifference by rolling around on the rug playing with the family cat, is secretly incensed. She is furious to be collectively conscripted into a massive, life-altering decision the kids and I think that she was never actually consulted about.
The father, the great orator and storyteller, is suddenly stripped of his words. He clears his throat a few nervous times, says absolutely nothing in his own defense, packs a bag, and moves out into a dilapidated, freezing, profoundly depressing gentleman's rooming house down the road called the Swan Hotel.
And it is in the immediate aftermath of this sudden banishment that we encounter what is arguably the most chilling, psychologically consequential scene in the entire text. It is a masterclass in the anatomy of a boundary, the anatomy of the mother's absolute no.
The scene plays out on a bitter late winter night. Young Gabrielle is alone in the kitchen doing the dinner dishes. Suddenly, her father appears like an apparition at the back door.
He looks completely hollowed out, physically dull, his eyes watery and sick. He taps weakly on the glass. He explains that the ancient pipes at the Swan Hotel have completely frozen solid, his room has no heat, and he desperately needs a blanket. He is shivering and mentions he might even be developing pneumonia.
Gabrielle instantly drops into stealth mode. She understands the high stakes of the house's new political divide.
She creeps up the dark stairs, navigating past the shadowy hallways, toward a massive wicker chest where she knows her mother meticulously stores the out-of-season clothes and the extra heavy linens. Her heart is pounding because she is terrified of waking her mother, whose bedroom is located just at the top of the next flight of stairs, and who still possesses those paranormal, hyper-attuned spider senses.
But the heavy wicker chest is betrayed by its hardware. It has these old, squeaky brass hinges, and as Gabrielle slowly, agonizingly lifts the heavy lid, the metal squeals sharply into the silence of the house.
Instantly, the mother hears it. She doesn't come out. She just calls down through the pitch-black hallway, "What are you doing?"
Gabrielle completely freezes. Her cover is blown.
She hisses a desperate whisper up the dark stairs, explaining the dire situation. Her dad is freezing. The hotel pipes burst. He might have pneumonia. He just needs a spare blanket from the chest.
And the mother, without turning on a single lamp, without getting out of bed to assess the situation, simply calls down a single syllable through the dark house. No.
It's just no. It is flat, it is singular, and it's absolute. Gabrielle slowly lets the heavy lid of the chest back down. But then she experiences a moment of profound internal hesitation. She retreats to her own bedroom. She looks at her own bed. She has one blanket to her name, a tacky, black, fake fur blanket lined with brown velour trim.
It's incredibly cheap, it's too small for her growing body, and it barely covers her at night.
But you have to remember the context of this house. This is an austere environment entirely devoid of soft, comforting childhood items. No pacifiers, no plush toys, no coddling. This cheap, tacky, fake fur blanket is Gabrielle's sole physical comfort object in the world. It is her ultimate security blanket.
She stands there, holding the blanket, deeply considering giving it to her freezing, suffering father. But the psychological reality is that she is only 10 years old. The emotional cost of parting with her only source of physical comfort is simply too high for a child to bear.
She cannot do it. So, feeling the crush of failure, she walks back downstairs completely empty-handed and delivers the devastating verdict to her sick father. Mom says no. And then she has to stand at the glass door and watch her father, the man who used to command the room with his stories, stagger away into the freezing, unforgiving night.
So, what does this all mean for the trajectory of a family? Gabrielle spends decades of her adult life turning this specific frozen memory over in her mind. Because as she realizes, that night wasn't merely about the physical denial of a woven blanket.
It was a demonstration of an absolute brick wall emotional boundary. The mother proved she possessed the terrifying power to completely, unilaterally deny physical comfort, to deny basic humanity, to a man she had built an entire life and 5 children with.
What's truly fascinating and deeply unsettling is how Gabrielle connects the mundane cruelty of that specific winter night to a much larger, darker, and more tragic speculation later in her life. Because in the years following Jeffrey's suicide, a pernicious rumor begins circulating in their hometown. An unverified gossip email eventually gets forwarded to Gabrielle's inbox.
The rumor is incredibly dark. It claims that in the weeks shortly before he chose to hang himself in the woods, Jeffrey's life had completely fallen apart. He had lost his firewood business, his primary source of income, he had lost his work truck, he was financially desperate and emotionally cornered.
And the rumor alleges that, in his final desperation, he called his mother in Vermont and asked if he could simply come live with her for a brief time to get back on his feet.
And the rumor alleges that the mother's response was a flat, unyielding, "No, don't come, I don't want to see you."
Now, it is crucial to note that Gabrielle explicitly acknowledges the murky nature of memory and gossip here. She states clearly that she does not know for an absolute certainty if this specific rumor is objectively true.
Furthermore, she is deeply careful and ethically responsible to state that the psychology of suicide is immensely complex. You can never accurately lay the blame for such a profound tragedy at any single person's feet. A simple two-letter word like no does not physically pull a trigger or tie a rope.
However, the rumor acts as a catalyst for her to start tracking what she brilliantly conceptualizes as the butter knife nose of her mother's lifetime.
The butter knife knows. It's such an evocative phrase for those mundane, everyday denials. No, you absolutely cannot have a snack between meals. No, you cannot stay up late to watch a television program. No, you cannot get a ride to school if you accidentally miss the bus.
Even if you are only 10 years old, even if the school is nearly 5 miles away, and even if walking means you end up getting viciously mauled by a neighborhood dog and requiring emergency stitches, the mother's absolute default setting in the face of her children's needs was a hard, unyielding boundary.
Gabrielle uses this history to ask a devastating, clinically profound question regarding emotional resilience. She asks, can a lifetime of these seemingly minor, everyday no's, when viewed in aggregate, act upon a person's psyche like an accruing viral load?
Does the emotional neglect reach a critical blood level where on the specific day you find yourself in ultimate suffocating despair, holding a rope in the woods, you briefly entertain the thought of calling your mother for help, but your nervous system already intimately knows the answer will be no, so you bypass the attempt entirely and simply get on with the act of dying?
It is a breathtakingly sad, piercingly intelligent speculation, and it powerfully illustrates how a child's foundational sense of safety and secure attachment within a family can be completely eroded, not necessarily by one massive, explosive trauma, but by 1,000 tiny, consistent emotional rejections over a decade. It perfectly mirrors the psychological revelation she had during the story of the SS France cruise ship.
The SS France memory is a brilliant structural metaphor for the entire book. It perfectly captures the jarring contrast between a child's assumed reality and the objective truth of the adult world.
I love how she frames this. When Gabrielle was just 5 years old, the entire family took a trip to France on this massive, luxurious ocean liner. They arrive at the bustling pier in New York City, and little 5-year-old Gabrielle looks up and sees the chalky, black iron hull of the ship towering impossibly high into the sky, secured to the dock by these massive, thick, braided mooring ropes.
And in her literal 5-year-old brain, she makes a terrifying assumption. She genuinely believes that to board the ship, the entire family will have to single file climb those massive ropes, hand over hand gym class style, while somehow carrying their heavy suitcases over the open water. She is paralyzed with terror.
Her anxiety is entirely real to her. She is walking up what she assumes is merely a preliminary ramp leading to the dreaded rope climbing station, dutifully carrying her little fastidiously packed suitcase, feeling her tiny body crushed under the immense psychological weight of this impending physical ordeal.
And then she reaches the top of the ramp, looks around, and realizes they are standing in a luxurious, fully carpeted lounge. They had simply walked directly onto the ship via a standard carpeted gangway.
She is so flooded with relief that she yells out, "We're on the ship! I thought we had to climb the ropes." Naturally, the entire family erupts in fond, condescending laughter at her childish mistake. But for Gabrielle, that exact moment crystallized a feeling of supreme, unshakable safety. As she stood there, she felt her family was a unified, indestructible, permanent vessel. She believed they were fastened together by emotional lag bolts welded into a forever place.
But the abrupt reality of the divorce and the chilling sound of the mother's absolute note, no echoing down the stairs to the freezing father, shattered that foundational illusion entirely. She realized with devastating clarity that a family is, to use her exact word, leavable.
The people who built the ship can simply pack their bags and walk down the gangway. The emotional lag bolts can, in fact, be undone with terrifying ease.
And once the parents consciously abdicate their designated roles as the architects, captains, and protectors of that shared vessel, the children are left completely adrift in the wreckage.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the terrifying, chaotic reality of what actually transpired after the parents abandoned their posts. This brings us to the aftermath of the divorce, which was defined by the children being entirely left to their own devices, leading to the incident with the Scirocco and the eruption of violent sibling warfare.
Immediately following the formal split, the family unit shatters geographically. The mother takes the two youngest children, Gabrielle and her brother Simon, and relocates to a progressive liberal art school in Vermont. This environment is a jarring culture shock.
It's characterized by circular conference table learning, mandatory sheep shearing, and teenagers casually smoking cigarettes in the school parking lot. But the true issue is domestic. Gabrielle absolutely loathes the cramped, depressing furnished rental her mother has chosen. She feels entirely suffocated by the mother's lingering, controlling presence.
Simon, meanwhile, rebels against the progressive environment so aggressively that he receives a scathing, highly critical evaluation from the headmaster and is essentially forced out of the institution.
The living situation becomes untenable. So, through a mutual, deeply spiteful agreement born of exhaustion, the mother and young Gabrielle declare that they never want to live under the same roof again. Consequently, the two young, volatile teenagers, Gabrielle and Simon, are shipped back to the massive house in Pennsylvania to live full-time with their father.
But here's the catastrophic catch. The father is utterly, fundamentally unequipped for the daily, grinding mechanics of solo parenting. We have to remember his character. He is a man who designed grand theatrical sets. He lived for the romance, not the maintenance. He never learned how to run a functional household.
The domestic reality of the Pennsylvania house quickly degrades. The refrigerator contains absolutely nothing but a few pieces of deeply freezer-burned chicken and a singular forgotten block of frozen lima beans. Furthermore, the father is completely drowning in the financial ruin brought on by the divorce, constantly dodging aggressive phone calls from debt collectors.
To stay afloat, he is working grueling hours at his studio in New York City, which means he is actively leaving these two newly traumatized, completely unmonitored teenagers entirely alone in a massive, echoing, empty house for days at a time.
It is an absolute recipe for disaster. Gabrielle is only 13 years old. Simon is 15. The father occasionally returns home for brief, exhausted pit stops. During one of these visits, looking completely haggard and overwhelmed, he verbally unloads his stress onto his children, complaining, "Jimmy Crickets, you kids are so expensive." It's one of those days when I could have pulled the wheel and driven myself right off the bridge.
Consider the immense psychological burden of a statement like that. Imagine being 13 years old, already grappling with the abandonment of your mother, and hearing your sole remaining caretaker explicitly link your financial costs to his own suicidal ideation. The guilt is instantaneous and crushing. It forces the child to realize, in a flash of terrifying clarity, that their mere existence is viewed as a lethal, intolerable burden.
Gabrielle's reaction to that statement is pure survival instinct. She instantly decides she must actively stop being a liability to her father. Without telling anyone, she walks into town and secures a grueling job as a dishwasher at a local restaurant.
Her motivation isn't pocket money, it's basic sustenance.
She works the dish pit simply to guarantee she receives one hot free meal, a shift, and a small paycheck. She realizes, with profound adult clarity, that there are no longer any functional adults in the room, and she alone must figure out the physical mechanics of her own survival.
But as sociology teaches us, nature abhors a vacuum of authority. Without a strong parental presence to enforce rules and mediate conflict, the two abandoned siblings inevitably turn on each other in a feral, primal battle for dominance and the house's scarce resources.
This complete breakdown of civilization within the home culminates in the terrifying saga of the Green VW Scirocco. The escalation here is wild, but entirely predictable given the lack of supervision. The father decides to purchase a brand new car, a sleek green Volkswagen Scirocco with tinted windows.
However, because he is trying to save money on city parking and tolls, he leaves the new car permanently parked in the Pennsylvania driveway while he takes the commuter bus into New York.
Gabrielle, who is essentially a ghost wandering this massive empty house, discovers the car keys carelessly tossed in a drawer, and she simply takes them. She begins illegally driving the car late at night. She is 13 years old. Because she doesn't know how to properly use a manual clutch, she figures out how to roll start the car in second gear.
She drives aimlessly around the pitch-black country roads, blasting the Bee Gees on her cassette Walkman, self-medicating her trauma with an intoxicating, highly dangerous surge of adult independence. In a psychological sense, driving that car allows her to feel she has aggressively seized agency in a chaotic world that had systematically stripped her of all power.
But Simon, the older brother, who was already deeply enmeshed in a dangerous, unsupervised life of underage binge drinking, wild partying, and minor suburban vandalism, discovers that his little sister has access to the keys. And operating on pure, unchecked older sibling entitlement, he simply opens the drawer and takes the keys from her.
He effortlessly commandeers her only source of freedom and power.
So how does a feral 13-year-old respond? With calculated vengeance. One night, Simon is taking a shower. He has carelessly left his clothes in a pile in the hallway. Gabrielle silently creeps up the stairs, aggressively digs a key out of the pocket of his jeans, and successfully steals the car back.
She drives off into the night to attend a high school party she wasn't even invited to, buzzing with a giddy, righteous sense of revenge against her oppressor. But her strategic foresight is limited by her youth. The inevitable reality of stealing from a stronger opponent is that, eventually, you have to return to the battleground.
And when she finally returns the car to the driveway, Simon is waiting for her in the dark. He is highly intoxicated, and he is absolutely blindly enraged. He immediately attacks her. And it's crucial to understand that this is not standard rough-and-tumble sibling rivalry. This is a brutal, physically dominating assault.
He grabs her by her hair and her neck and physically drags her through the yard, dragging her body through the thick pachysandra bushes. He then grabs her by the leg and drags her violently down a set of rough railroad tie steps, inflicting severe, bloody road rash across her back and legs. Gabrielle distinctly remembers the sharp chemical smell of the creosote seeping from the wooden ties as her skin was scraped across them.
The level of explosive violence is terrifying, and it signals a complete collapse of domestic safety. The assault escalates further when Simon drops her bruised ankle and strides purposefully into the kitchen, heading directly toward the center island, where the father prominently displays his collection of razor-sharp, vintage Chicago cutlery chef's knives.
Genuinely fearing that her brother intends to grab a knife and slash her, Gabrielle scrambles to her feet, bolts out the door, and runs blindly into the pitch-black woods. She crosses the active train tracks and is forced to cower in weed-choked drainage ditches for hours, terrified of the sweeping headlights of passing cars, absolutely convinced that Simon is actively hunting her in the dark. She only manages to survive the night by creeping to a friend's house as the sun finally comes up.
It is the literal embodiment of a Lord of the Flies scenario playing out in suburban Pennsylvania. The foundational civilization of the family has been entirely eradicated, and the aftermath of this violence is what truly breaks Gabrielle's relationship with her father. When she finally manages to contact him in the city, leaving a desperate note, they arrange to meet for lunch at an upscale, fancy local tavern called Colligan Stockton Inn.
As she sits down at the table, she is still operating under the desperate, lingering hope of childhood. She fully expects her father to act like a parent. She expects him to be visibly outraged, to finally lay down the law, to banish Simon, to protect her.
She physically untucks her shirt in the middle of the restaurant to reveal the massive weeping scabs and deep purple bruises covering her back and legs. She presents him with the undeniable, empirical, physical proof of her brother's violent, nearly lethal assault.
And her father, casually sipping his glass of chilled white wine, looks at the wounds, clears his throat, and delivers a response so chilling it permanently alters their relationship. He says, "Well, it's a good thing it wasn't me, because if I'd been home, I would finish the job."
It is the ultimate devastating betrayal of the parent-child contract. Faced with the physical evidence of his own failure to protect his children, the father completely abdicates his role. He is so consumed by his own financial stress, so deeply resentful of the overwhelming burden of parenting, that he actively aligns himself with the violent aggressor against his own daughter.
He essentially blames her for the chaos. He casually mentions that he gave Simon strict instructions not to lay a hand on her and lazily orders her to go back to the house and deal with it. But the psychological damage of that statement is permanent and irreversible.
She does return to the house because she has nowhere else to go. But from that day forward, she and Simon enter a silent, bitter Cold War that lasts for the next 40 years. They live under the same roof as teenagers, but they cease to speak.
Decades later, if they are forced to be in the same room for an unavoidable family holiday, they stand at opposite ends of the room. They endure 40 years of self-imposed solitary confinement within the boundaries of their own family. It is a tragic, enduring testament to what happens to the human psyche when children are forced to entirely self-parent.
The immense pressure ensures they either completely break or they develop a fierce, almost unapproachable feral independence that propels them forward into adulthood, but leaves them deeply, permanently scarred in their ability to trust.
The parental safety net wasn't simply torn in this family, it was systematically dismantled and removed entirely. And when children are left alone with nothing but the broken scraps of their family's former mythology, they are forced to cobble together their own independent reality just to survive.
Gabrielle made her choice. She chose the harsh, undeniable reality of the restaurant dish pit, the reality of grueling physical work, and the reality of verifiable facts. She eventually chose the comforting, soft, woven hammock of the fact-checker because the charismatic storytellers in her life, the people who promised romance and beauty, had ultimately proven to be incredibly dangerous, highly unreliable, and in her darkest hour, entirely absent.
The journey we've taken today is staggering. We started with a charming, seemingly low-stakes debate between an elderly mother and a magazine fact-checker over the ingredients of a Corsican tomato sandwich.
And through the meticulous unspooling of memory, we journeyed through the violent, total collapse of a family structure, resulting in the tragedy of a suicide, a bitter 40-year sibling estrangement, and a terrified 13-year-old girl hiding for her life in a drainage ditch.
It forces us to deeply, perhaps uncomfortably, reconsider the foundational stories we tell ourselves about our own upbringing. Families are, at their very core, shared mythologies built to keep the darkness at bay. We fundamentally rely on the architects of that mythology, our parents, to maintain the structural integrity of the narrative.
When they abruptly abandon the project, the children are left wandering the ruins, desperately trying to make sense of the conflicting artifacts and memories left behind.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought for you to carry with you today.
If our family identities are constructed much like Daddy-O's plywood theater sets, designed to look incredibly real, beautiful, and deeply romantic, but only if you view them from a very specific, controlled angle in the audience, what happens to us when we finally summon the courage to step off the stage? What happens when we walk backstage into the cold light and closely examine the raw, splintered, unpainted wood of our own pasts? Does finally discovering the objective truth of our childhood actually set us free? Or does it simply leave us standing alone in the dark, holding the hammer, realizing we now have to build our own reality from scratch?